Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dualistic Unity movie review series. I don't know what the fuck's going on. I feel like I've said that a number of times in these intros, but every time there's more and more that I am uncertain about. But seeing things from a different point of view allows me to be less and less certain over and over and over again, and yet more free the more uncertain I get.
And as much as I exist here and now, I also exist as all of the here and now that Ray will ever be. So I'm not just Ray here now. I'm also Ray in the here now that started Ray, as well as Ray in the here now that will be the end of Ray. And it's all one Ray, it's all one experience from start to finish that we perceive through linear time. But because all of those moments exist, they will always exist. And they don't necessarily exist in order except to the experiencer. So the entirety of Ray, from birth to death, exists here and now, and I'm all of it. And on that note, today's movie review is about Arrival, which came out in 2016 and stars Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner. This movie is fantastic. I love the premise of this movie, which is very much about how we think and how it changes our perspective of the life that we're experiencing. So if you haven't watched this movie as yet, spoiler alert, we are going to basically reveal everything that's incredible about this movie. I'm probably going to do so in the next 30 seconds. So this is your chance to go pause the episode, go and watch the movie. We'll see you in 2 hours. All right, welcome back. So obviously, the little girl's death that we see at the beginning of the movie doesn't actually take place at the beginning of the movie, which is fantastic. The first time I watched that movie, it didn't sit right with me because I was like, hold on, something's not working. She doesn't seem to actually recognize that she's having a memory as she's having that memory. And it's because she wasn't, which is why it didn't make any sense. But how often, out of curiosity, do you have visuals go through your head of some future instance that might happen and disregard them as not being possible when in fact they may actually be a glimpse at your future?
And so, thank you for kicking this one off because for those who have been on our Patreon calls today, it's been super, super difficult for me to avoid this because it kept popping up. Of course, in the conversation, it was like, yeah, it would be like on the tip of my tongue. How am I going to talk about it? So I am excited to get into it now because that's just it. Everything you just said. I don't know what things are leading to. I don't know what I'm going through right now is going to inform version of Andrew in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, in 50 years. We see it all the time. It's right in front of us. All of the experiences that we've ever had, we're able to pull from when we interact with people, when we have conversations with people. I wouldn't be here if I've talked about it many times, going through high school, being socially anxious, dealing with, fear of what other people are going to think of me. I had to go through all of that in order to learn the lessons that I did, in order to be willing to let go, in order to be able to connect with people, empathize with people, talk with people, and be like, I'm super concerned about this. Oh, yeah, I've been there. I've had that experience. And so we see that, but we don't see that that is this. That experience that we had once that we're able to now pull from that's super useful and beneficial. Yesterday on another Patreon call, someone was talking about, performance anxiety in regards to sports. It's like, oh yeah, I've been through that. The whole time I was going through it, I was like, oh fuck, why is this happening? Not realizing in 10 years, I'm going to be on a call. Someone's going to bring the topic up. I'm going to be able to relate to them. There's going to be a connection there. There's going to be an insight. There's going to be a process of communication. So all the things you're going through right now, the difficult times, the struggles, the suffering, the rut you feel like you're in, the intrusive thoughts you're dealing with, they're all opportunities to learn something from them because you don't know when those will be pulled from in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. You have no idea. So I keep saying, I don't know what the fuck's going on. I don't have any idea. I don't know what this situation now, but the more you see, the more you recognize how little you know. And where you're like, oh, this could be something that I learned from. And then it's so much less heavy. Like the weight gets a lot lighter when you realize that this is something happening. It's not to say that, oh, this is, I'm gonna learn from it and I need to go through it. And it's none of that stuff. It's like this is going to be an opportunity for future me to pull from and learn something from. So I know that I didn't mention anything about the movie right now, but I had to just get that out there because I've been holding that one back and it has been smacking me upside the face since I ended up watching this movie twice. Second time around, this one hit so much harder than the first time around. So if you've only seen it once, most people are probably going to be like, oh, I got to see that one again after they see, that basically the timeline we perceive, the movie basically starts on the day they arrived. And then it's like the beginning of that could just be placed at the end. It's just like a looped video someone does. You think you're watching the end. Meanwhile, they filmed that part before they filmed the beginning so that they could then loop it back. But you don't know where things are going, what things you're currently experiencing that you're going to be able to refer to in the future. And because they're you now too. You're informing yourself in each and every moment, every iteration of yourself. We just perceive it as, moving through time linearly. And it isn't that. It isn't what you think.
But now that is the fun part about four-dimensional time, is the recognition that you now is you in the future. That it's all one person, that you are not limited to your body so much as your entire timeline is what you are. Not your character, but everything that character will ever be in every iteration of that character going from start to finish. All of those moments are one person. All of those moments are one being in the fourth dimension. Right? When you remove time as a separating factor, you end up being the entirety of your lifespan instead of just one moment individually separated from every other moment. Which is why in the movie, one of the things I really did enjoy was when she finally figured out, oh, I can look at my future and pull information from what I've learned there and use it here. And who's to say that that isn't possible? But this goes back to the premise of the movie, which is that our experience of time, our experience of reality itself, is very much influenced by the way that we think, which influences the way that we language. And that's it. So if we address the way that we think, perhaps we have access to our quote unquote future selves, as well as more access to our quote unquote past selves. How much of our past can we not remember simply by virtue of us not being willing to accept that maybe we can? Oh, that's too far back. I can't possibly remember that. It's like, how much time have you spent trying? How much time have you spent letting go of how you currently think in order to see what else is in there when you're not wrapped up in how you currently think? And so one of the things I really enjoyed about this movie was that it's not just about the process of learning this whole other way of thinking that is very circular. The fact that they communicated in logograms, for example, that there was no beginning and end to any sentence that they said, changed the entire form of communication. Everything was a circle. There was no beginning and end. So that changed the perception of time. It changed the perception of what anything had meaning about, because it was a complete thought in itself. So that was really interesting. But watch humanity throughout that movie just lose its shit. And there were so many moments where it was quite obviously humans doing it to themselves, because the aliens were just sitting there trying to have a chat. Meanwhile, humanity is making all of these assumptions. Humanity is panicking constantly. Why? Based on the mentality that is driven into us by the very language that we use day to day. So it's all connected. And so it was really interesting to see, just like we do in our own personal lives, as we start to question the mentality that we become familiar with, there is a lot of turbulence going through that process, because it is like going from one world to another. It's not just that in the movie they learn the aliens' language. They stepped into the aliens' experience of the universe.
And that's what this whole movie was a fantastic representation of, was the perspective the aliens took was very close to a unity perspective, you could label it as, whereas the humans were very much egotistical. And, we had Amy Adams' character very much kind of in between, like recognize, coming from the egotistical mentality, but being curious enough that she's willing to explore what's possible, as well as Jeremy Renner's character. He was like, a little bit behind her in the willingness to question that, but he came around and then was willing to step into their reality. But you could see, at the start of the movie, just the response to just them being there. And you wonder, how can aliens or whatever you want to call them communicate with us, or touch down with us, and then you see something like that. Like all they did, they didn't even touch the ground. They were floating the whole time. They didn't even technically touch down on Earth. And yet this response was nuts. And there were so many assumptions, so much like we got to use force. And that was what those military guys were listening to. The guy on the TV, like they're we're not even, they don't even have guns, half the people that are involved in this. We got to show them a show of force. And then that little inkling got in their heads. And that's why, the dynamite was brought in there. That's why they had to see that was the only option. Because why? Because they're afraid. Obviously, they were so clearly afraid. So all they could see, and that was a threat. As long as you're afraid, all you see are threats all over. And it's the same with our mentality. Not to go on too much of a tangent here, but as long as you're afraid of judgment, all you see is judgment. As long as you're afraid of how people perceive you, all you see is how people perceive you. It's always about you. It's always about the threat to you. And as you let go of that fear, you don't see the judgment everywhere. You don't see the threats everywhere. You see an opportunity because you're not so afraid. And that's what we saw in Amy Adams' character and Jeremy Renner. If their fear dropped. Everyone was afraid at first, certainly, but then you got a little bit curious. What have they done? Well, they haven't shown any signs of force. Okay. So then maybe we can step into that uncertainty, but maybe they are forceful, but maybe they're not. Maybe there's an opportunity to learn. Maybe there's a lot to gain from them, like an entirely new language that they found out that can bring us back to closer to that mentality that they are able to embody. But it is really interesting, the reflection of the language on the way we perceive reality, just thinking about in the English language, like sentence structure, beginning and end, like the importance of every bit along the way, how we read it, how we talk about it, the time that it takes to express it, all of those things reinforce it. We talk all the time about how many things in our society reinforce our perception of division, taking, time to be truth, not seeing time and space as just illusions. And yeah, even language reinforces it. And that's a big part of the backbone of how we interact with each other, how we communicate. So it's a massive part of our day-to-day lives. It's a massive part of our reality. And because of the way it's structured, it's reinforcing that illusion. But through that, as we saw in this movie, like, maybe there can be a shift there as we let go of that idea that that's exactly how things have to be, as if language wasn't just another made up thing.
Man, there's so many things you just said, and I've got so much I want to comment on. I mean, the first thing, of course, is the fact that the aliens themselves, their ship left no footprint. There was no gas. There was nothing emitted. There was no driving propulsion. There was nothing. It was like it didn't even exist there. It didn't make any sound. It didn't have any friction. There was nothing. It was like it wasn't even part of reality. Right up to the end of the movie, where they basically evaporated. So not only is their experience of time different, but their experience of space, of matter itself, would be different as well. And how much of that is based on their perception of themselves and their place in the universe? I mean, the consideration that humanity is going to help us in 3,000 years is a hell of a long-term view. So I thought that was really, really interesting. I also wanted to comment on the fact that we will almost always assume that other people are going to do the things that we would do ourselves. So a liar will always assume somebody is lying to them. The military will always assume someone's going to attack them. And a linguist or a scientist will assume that that person's curious and wants to chat. And I thought that was really interesting because when they first came up to the ship, there was this dialogue happening where they were saying, yeah, after 2 hours, we just kind of get slid out of the ship and they have to repressurize and put more oxygen in there for the next time we come back in 18 hours. And they're like, well, that's a long time to repressurize a room or fill it with oxygen. And Jeremy Renner's like, well, yeah, but if their atmosphere is different in the ship, then it would actually take that long because they would have to put all of this care and consideration into creating an environment for humans to be safe and comfortable in. And the immediate response is, oh, so they can suffocate us whenever they want.
Exactly, because that's the assumption. You know, that's what we would do if we were getting involved with some other species. We'd have to conquer them because that's human nature to conquer, to take ownership for everything, to own everything. Isn't that fascinating? That of course we always assume what we would do. Fuck. But with the lack of footprint and the vanishing at the end of the movie, like that really made me wonder. I was like, so did they ever really exist? But is that not everything? Like you're already dead. Does any of this really exist in the way that we think it does? Yes and no, right?
Exactly. And when they left, did they go forward to the 3,000-year mark where humanity was going to be there to help them now? Is their experience of time and space exactly what we've been talking about, in that there is only the present moment, so long as you are able to maintain the perception or the recognition that that is the case? There's so many questions in that movie, and there's so many interesting parts about that movie. Specifically, I really enjoyed the fact that the language used by Abbott and Costello are all moving symbols. I love that because we're often talking about symbolism. And of course, you're like, well, what's the symbolism here? Well, it's not symbolism that we would understand, but it's symbolism that we would learn to eventually recognize. This is why I liked Amy Adams' character at the end. She's like, I can read it because she could tap into the future where she had already gone through the process of deciphering all this and becoming familiar with it. Right. So that was fucking awesome. But there's a lot in this movie. I did want to mention something quickly. There was a point at the beginning of the movie where Amy Adams' character, Louise, and Jeremy Renner's character, Ian, meet for the first time on the helicopter, and they're having a conversation. I really enjoyed this conversation because he was reading her book, and she was saying that language is the foundation of civilization. And he kind of giggled, and he's like, yeah, that's pretty good. It's wrong. And she's like, what? And he's like, what's science? Obviously science. And I thought that was really funny because if not for language, why would two people do any kind of science?
Exactly. So it's almost like they necessitate each other. Like language is necessary in order to do the science, and then the science informs that. And it's that loop again, kind of like dualistic unity in a way. Like they inform each other. And but I'm glad you brought up the point of being able to tap into her future self, because that is what that was another massive insight that hit me, is understanding that everything we do takes time and attention. Like that's all it takes, just time and attention. If you can understand that, given enough time and attention, you'll learn that thing. So there is an iteration of you. Say you want to learn a new language. Say you don't understand Spanish, you want to learn Spanish. You know that there's a future you that understands Spanish. How much can you diminish that gap through not only understanding that you already know it, but letting go of the judgment of the progress along the way, because you know that the judgment just, you know, elongates that process. So is it always that? Like, is it always right there if we're willing to get out of the way, being able to step into that? And is it not just the time that we take, the process of going through, looking at the flashcards, or listening to the audio files of Spanish words or whatever, that are just sort of an excuse in a way? It's what we need in order to make sense of getting from point A to point B, from not knowing to knowing. And I'm not saying that it won't take any process of experience, but you know, how much of that can be diminished by just letting go of any judgment whatsoever, knowing that it's going to get there at some point. Like there is absolutely 100% an iteration of you that can fully speak Spanish. And all it takes is that time and attention. Like how much is relaxing into that recognition and just maintaining that relaxation of knowing it's going to happen, not in the manifestation-y way, because through that way, it's because it's going to mean something about you. It's going to add to you, give you more value. What if you let go of all that and just recognized it for what it was? How much of that time can you diminish for anything, for learning anything new? Really makes you wonder.
Well, and what is it that you're learning at the end of the day? Let's just say you decided that you want to learn to play the cello. What's the difference between you fumbling about with a cello right now versus you mastering a cello in 10 years? Not the musical theory, that's all stuff you're going to learn. Not how to play, that's all stuff you're going to learn through attention. But what you will learn is the care and the consideration and the focus and the attention on what you're doing over 10 years. A master cellist pays very close attention to each and every note they play. They are very, very attentive to what they're doing, which is why they're a master. Whereas an amateur is fumbling about judging themselves most of the time, still trying to learn the rudiments and judging themselves for not knowing them. And so, how quickly could you learn the cello if you could start it with the same level of care and attention that a master has?
Makes you wonder because it's the mentality shift. Like the mentality is completely different. Like that's the biggest change between the amateur and the master. It's the attentiveness combined with the relaxation of having been through it. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you go from amateur to master tomorrow, but how much more quickly can you get there through just being as attentive as a master and as relaxed as a master is in quotes for anyone listening. But how, yeah. And because it's not about, well, if it takes me this much time, then this means this. And if it takes me less time, then that means more about me. It's like it's going to take the time that it takes. But how much quicker could that be in a certain mentality? Like, could it even, is this even me keeping that at bay? Is this even me keeping that snap of the finger recognition at bay like Luis was able to do when she, in a very stressful moment towards the end of the movie, when she was able to tap into that future memory, interacting with Shang and getting his phone number, his private number, she's able to do that in an instant and then hear it, speak Mandarin, say the exact thing that he whispered in her ear to tell him that. That was in the moment. She didn't have to learn that. She didn't have to learn how to do it. She didn't have to learn, something about his phone number. Like she just tapped into that. It was immediate because it was here now. And it was just that illusion of time and perception of progressing through time and space that shifted that. Because it wasn't only, the time difference, it was the space. She wasn't in the same location necessarily because they go together. The illusions go together. So she was able to tap into that in a moment and then express it in, the here and now that she was in. How available is that when you recognize just how much that time and space is an illusion?
And that's really the question, is how much really is available and how much of this is just condensing the learning process versus stepping out of linear time entirely. Because that's the thing, is that it's not that she didn't have to learn Shang's phone number or learn what to say to him. She did learn it in the future. It's just that she didn't see her past self and her future self being different selves anymore. She was acting as the entirety of her lifetime, which is why at the end of the movie, when she asks Jeremy Renner, if you could see the entirety of your life, what would you do differently? Well, I'd probably express myself a bit more, right? Which was a fine answer. But the point is you would accept it, you would embrace it, right? Because you'd see the whole thing. But how many of our decisions are based on us not seeing the entirety of our life in terms of as who we are? Instead, we look at this moment like, oh, I got to live up to something, or it's going to mean something about me. But it's your entire life. Your entire life is your purpose, as we've said before. Right. So it really is just a change in mentality, and that is a practice, which is why when I mentioned earlier the conversation between language or science being the foundation of civilization, I think it's really interesting because this movie kind of positions it that language in itself is kind of a science.
Exactly. And being able to see your entire life and everything that it entails and still acting like still being there for it, as attentive as you can possibly be, like it's no different than the experience that we're having in each and every moment. It still begets the same exact lesson, whether you can see everything exactly how it's going to play out or not. It still comes down to priority of being attentive to where you're at. And you see that play out in her interactions with her daughter, especially, when once you know that she knows, she knows that her daughter is going to get sick and die pretty young. She knows, and she still chooses to go through it. And you can see it. You can see the sort of gravity she feels in each moment, whereas there's absolutely the attention, but there's still the fleeting idea of, you know, this isn't gonna, I'm gonna see her die before she sees me die. And that, but that isn't her priority. Her priority is being there in the experience with her daughter. And that's always it, because we don't know what the future is going to hold. She knew that her daughter was going to die at a certain point. That could be any of us. Any of us could be in that situation, and we don't know. And yet we act as if we do. We act as if, oh, that's such a tragedy, knowing that she's going to live to however old she was, teens, 20, something like that. But like that could be any of us. It could be tomorrow. So it's that same sort of gravity in each and every moment that we don't look at, because we just assume that we settle upon the certainty that we're going to be, at least 80, 90 years old when we die. So we allow moments to pass. We allow them to go without taking the time and attention to look at them for what they are. And it's no different. It really isn't, because we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. So that uncertainty should create the same sort of gravity and attention to the experience that we're having as it did in her life, understanding her daughter and the situation she was going to end up in. And yet, for some reason, it doesn't.
It was really interesting that as Louise started to perceive time differently, as she let go of the idea of linear time, her appreciation of the moment deepened, regardless of what that moment brought. She knew that the future would hold pain, and the knowledge of that loss, the knowledge that there would be pain, informed the beauty to a very large degree. And how often do we go into relationships and not keep in mind that this is just one moment in your entire life, right? Don't take it for granted. This is going to change things. It always does. So treat it for what it is, which is a part of your journey, not just this one moment that will pass, right? Nothing is disconnected from anything else. So being in the present allows you to get more out of the time that you're experiencing, but thinking about time takes you out of it very, very quickly, because you're worried about not getting somewhere. You're trying to get somewhere instead of just being where you are, which makes it very difficult to appreciate the people in your life. We have often talked about how it can be valuable to remember one day you're going to die. It can also help to remember that one day everyone's going to die, and you don't know if they're going to die before you or after you. So appreciate them. But that requires you to look at the entirety of your life and not just the one person that you think you need.
Exactly. It's always right there. That uncertainty begets that. That it's always right there. And so I have a question, because with the end of the movie, it's like very powerful when he asks, you want to make a baby, and she says yes. And so I'm curious, just in how the movie plays out. This is sort of along the lines of butterfly effect. Like if she had somehow said no, like how that may have impacted everything, and like she hadn't, or if that was even a possibility. Like obviously it was because she has free will, despite being able to see that. That's just one, and this is something that hit me too. Like that's just one iteration that she's seeing. And so we go through, hypotheticals in our head. Those are all potential things. Like every single moment moving forward is a path we could go down. Like there are an infinite number of ways that you could go down right now. There's no preset path. It's always the one that you're on. You are your path, but it is entirely based upon the decisions that you make. And so you can imagine, you could go through in your head, think of being married with kids, and you can see that changing. Your partner looks different, the kids look different, because those are all in infinity, in eternity. Those are all things, all potential lives that you live. And so it kind of made me wonder, yes, she's seeing that. Yes, she's pulling from the future and gaining from it, but it doesn't mean that that's the only future she could have experienced. But because she was attentive to it, she was able to pull useful things from it. But it doesn't mean that that is the only path her life could have taken. So I think it's almost as if, if she had said no, she doesn't want to have a kid, like that path of having the kid and her daughter in that way still exists here and now. And so she was still able to utilize that, but it's based on the decisions we make in each and every moment that, sort of creates that path that we can look back on and see, oh, there was a path. But moving forward, there's just infinite potential in any direction, wherever we're willing to go with it. And so I don't see it as the sole path and necessary that I just kind of circled back to, because when I started talking, I wasn't so sure, and came full circle, which is symbolic of this movie and review. But yeah, it's
I love the fact that we managed to take what is admittedly a pretty deep movie and bring it around to the point where it could have been deeper. That's kind of funny in itself, because what you're saying is true. Like the movie is still very much limited by the idea of Amy Adams' character having a set timeline going into the future, because she could have made a different decision, but perhaps in making a different decision, she wouldn't have met Shang at that get together in the future, not making it possible for. But then again, how would she have had the memory of the future if she didn't meet Shang? And there's the paradox again. So there's a lot more to this question. And of course, now we're still talking about Amy Adams' character being human as opposed to the awareness of the universe. And so it all gets way deeper and more interesting when you really break it open into a dualistic unity style conversation. One day we're going to have to make a movie. This does definitely remind me of the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, because they do take into account that there are all of these different iterations, there are all of these different timelines that simultaneously exist as well, and that you can tap into those timelines by resonating with that mentality. Good movie. We'll probably cover that in a future review. But this has been a great review. This movie's awesome. I really do enjoy this movie for the fact that how often do we look at language itself as being a limitation on how we experience reality? And yet we know that's the case from all of our conversations about concepts, about the description not being described. And yet here we are describing the experience of time willy-nilly, assuming that it's true.
yeah, there's so much about this movie that hit me really hard. And even just, I keep saying, I don't know what the fuck's going on, but even with that, recognizing I don't know what the current experience is going to be useful for in the future, but I also don't know, thoughts that arise inside of my mind, the experience that I'm having, if that's not like all of the timelines impacting all of the other ones. Like I'm actually experiencing parts of me, you can picture it just because we have to use images and whatnot, like going in and out of different timelines, because there is no one timeline. We're existing in infinite timelines in each and every moment. There is an infinite number of ways that my life could go from right now. I'm gonna have the experience of one sort of, but who's to say that it's not all a culmination of all of them all the time? And like they're all impacting the one I call my experience in this reality, in this moment. But those are all just words. Those are all just concepts too. Who's to say that I'm not also gaining and experiencing things from all the other timelines of all the other iterations of me, even beyond Andrew? It's like from Ray's lifetime and anyone else's lifetime that are being experienced, which they are. We're interacting with each other all the time. So our timelines are always overlapping, and our infinite timelines that we're always experiencing and always are impacting all of the other infinite timelines of everyone else. And so to think we could ever possibly have any idea what exactly is going on in each and every moment, it's just absurd to think that we can settle upon that. But unless you have anything else to add, I think this has been an awesome chat. I fucking loved this movie and I hope everyone enjoyed. And for anyone who was on Patreon earlier, I'm glad I was finally able to talk about this because I was holding back that main insight I started with the whole time. So I appreciate everyone for sticking it out. And if you haven't watched the movie, just go watch it. You might want to watch it twice. And thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone.